The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
But the old days, your best argument was your tongue. And if that didn't work, it could be pretty drastic after that. Now, it's a rougher society. There's more problems. The criticism of the police generally is at an all-time high. Although if you speak to people privately, most of them will say, we're fortunate to have the policing we have in Canada. And I can tell you from my experience with the United Nations, where I dealt with police organizations and judicial systems in a lot of places in the world, we are fortunate. You can criticize all you want about some incident that took place that wasn't as elegantly handled as it should be, but I can tell you, if it had been in some other country, it would have been far worse. And if you had ended up in their jails, it would be far worse than we provide, and so on. So fortunately, the young person coming into the police today has a whole lot more education than it did in my generation when we came in. When I joined the force, you could write the exams if you had a grade 10, and if you had a completed high school, you were considered really quite well educated. There were almost nobody coming into the force with degrees as recruits in those years. We would recruit the odd people with degrees to go and work in our forensic laboratories and in certain specialized areas of the force, but they were not regular recruits that had come up through depot. Now, if you go to the depot now and look at a squad, I suspect that at least 75% of them will have better than a high school education, maybe a higher percentage than that even, I'm not sure. And the problem with that is, I mean, that's good stuff. But some of those people with their good education don't really want some of the postings in some of the communities that we have in the force where life is at a very different level. There are still a lot of pretty isolated posts in Canada, where somebody with a university degree is looked at as an egghead. Not as so it's not easy to manage. The other big issue that someday will have to be straightened out is really, constitutionally, what should the role of the federal government be in policing in Canada? When you go back and look at the history, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was formed in 1920 out of two former federal organizations, the old Royal Northwest Mounted Police, who had its headquarters in Regina, and the Dominion Police, which were down here in Ottawa, put together under a new statute, formed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with headquarters in Ottawa. It was quite a small organization. There were no contracts at that time, none at all. The main reason that the new force was created had its roots basically in Asia and Europe, and again, that requires a little explanation. During World War I, well, I'm going to go back even further than that. I'm going to go back as far as the Boer War. The force, the old Northwest Mounted Police, as originally established, was a very military type organization. The original officers were military officers. The training was very military-like, and it still was in 1947 to a degree. We had contingents that fought in the Boer War. It was very involved, the old force, with what was known as the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. And the result of the good performance in what were basically military operations in South Africa and in Western Canada, it allowed to become called the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police, from 1905, when the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan and the present boundaries of Manitoba were formed out of the Northwest Territories, the governments of those new provinces just kept the old force in place. They contracted with the federal government, and it stayed in place until 1917. And in 1917, all of those contracts were cancelled. So by 1920, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were formed, there were no policing contracts at all. And let me talk just a bit about 1917. Because of the proud military background of the force, when the First World War started in 1914, many members wanted to go to the military or have the force go as a contingent as part of the Canadian forces and so on. And that was denied. And it was denied because the United States were not in the war. And there was a huge population of Germanic background in the United States. And the big fear was that what was known as, I forget the expression, but that they would come up and try and influence fifth column activity. They would come up and try and influence things in Canada which would be contrary to the war effort in our factories and in our military and one thing or another. So there was as tight control as possible along the border, and the members of the force were not allowed to leave until 1917, when the Americans joined the war and suddenly dealt with their own Germanic population, and it was no longer a worry to Canada. And so many of our people then enlisted for overseas service, and the federal government canceled all the contracts. So in 1917, all of the provinces had their own policing arrangements in place, and there was the only place that the federal force was doing what I would call daily police work was in the two northern territories, the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, as they were at that time. During the war, at the outbreak of World War I, the Russians were allies with Britain and France and so on. They were with the Western Allies, and there was an Eastern Front against the Germans. In 1917, when the Russian Revolution took place, it was the new Red government formed a pact with the Germans and withdrew from Allied support. At that time, there was still civil war going on in Russia. The Tsar and the old regime had been overthrown, and the new Red government was in place in Ottawa, in Moscow. But there was still a White Army. There were many parts of Russia that didn't want that change. There was civil war going on between the Red Army and the White Army. On the Allied, in the war front on the Allied side, the Russian ports, both the northern ports around Murmansk and the Pacific ports around Vladivostok and so on, were full of equipment, much of it American equipment, that had been sent to them to help them fight the Germans. And they were deadly afraid that suddenly the Germans would, because of the new pact between the Red government and Germany, that all that equipment would fall into German hands and be used against the Allies on the Western Front. So what to do about it? They sent over a big contingent of people, including the Northwest Mounted Police troop that was in Vladivostok in 1918. And they were supposed to be there along with a lot of other contingents from Allied governments and so on to help the White Army defeat the Reds. Well, finally cooler heads prevailed and they left, and our contingent came back to Canada, and it was the mounted troops were in Vancouver and in Regina basically at that time, and the conditions in Canada were pretty difficult at the end of World War I. There was thousands of returned men coming back, many of them injured people, and there was no real provision for it. The labor unrest was at a very high degree, and at the political level, the feeling was that this was all communist instigated out of Moscow, and they were talking about, you know, the Comintern and the international movement of overthrowing the capitalist system and one thing or another. And the federal government was really taken by surprise when the general strike in Winnipeg took place in 1919. Everybody quit, including the police and so on. There was a general strike. And the constitutionally, the federal government, responsible for order and discipline and good government in the country, had to do something. What did they do? They called upon the old Royal Northwest Mounted Police mounted contingents to go to Winnipeg, and they galloped up and down the street, and ever since have been criticized by some and praised by others for bringing that general strike to a conclusion and getting back and letting the provincial police and the fire services and everything get back to work and so on. But the realization in Ottawa was that, you know, when something happens, we have nothing really short of the militia. And we really don't want to call out the military against our own citizens. We need something else. And the decision was to put these two forces together, the old Royal Northwest Mounted Police, who had no contracts at that time, and the Dominion Police, form a disciplined organization that could be deployed by the federal government anywhere in the country quite quickly if civil order broke down. And it has a lot to do with what our regulations were, including the regulations when I joined and probably when Al Nicholson joined. At that time, you had to be single. You had to stay single for at least 5 years. There was a limit. I can't quite remember the figure, but I think it was 50%. No more than 50% of the force could be married. So there had to be a vacancy in the marriage establishment, even if you had your five years and so on. And all of that goes back to the reasons that were in place when they formed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1920, to have a mobile, disciplined organization that could be moved back and forth across the country when civil order breaks down and trouble breaks out. The federal government, responsible for peace, order, and good government, have an obligation. And that was really why the force was formed. It was small. The original Royal Canadian Mounted Police was quite a small organization. Even when I joined it in 1947, the annual report of the Commissioner to Parliament in that year, in those years they used to report to Parliament, not to a minister. The total strength of the force, including attached civilians, was just under 3,100, all across the whole of country. The nature of things changed in 1929. In 1929, the province of Saskatchewan, which had fairly large territory, but very small population at that time, still very much a pioneer province, had great fiscal difficulties. They couldn't really afford to pay their police and other structures that were needed to govern. And they proposed to the federal government that you give us some money and we'll take over your federal policing duties, and you people can go away, and we'll have enough money to have our provincial police. The federal government didn't buy that. They turned around and said, no, you pay us a little bit of money, and we'll do your policing. And that's how we got back into contracting. And in those days, the contracts, the money ratio was much more in favor of the provinces than it is now. And it was a good financial deal. Plus that, not only was it good financially, suddenly the province had no worries about recruiting. They had no worries about training. Any member of the federal police force that got into trouble, they didn't have to defend them. That was up to the Department of Justice because it was federal. Any suits that were brought against the force and they had to be paid out of federal coffers, not provincial. And it was a very good deal for the province. Plus that, the province had long memories of the old original force that had been out in the prairies since 1873 or whatever the year was, and had a pretty good reputation. After all, many of the principal cities and communities were originally police posts, you know. That's how they got established. And they were there before the white settlers came along. So that's how it started. And times were tough at the end of the 20s and in the 30s, and a number of other provinces said, hey, that's a good deal. And suddenly, the federal government had contracts with Alberta. The first one was Saskatchewan, then Alberta, Manitoba, the three maritime provinces, and so on. But there were no such thing as municipal contracts. They were contracts for the federal policing. And the nature of the force started to change. Instead of being the original body of highly disciplined, portable men that the feds could move back and forth across the country as needed to deal with problems and to deal with what I will call intelligence operations, because, as I've said before, the fear back in the 1917, 1918, 1919 was all this was being instigated by the communists in Moscow, and the federal government depending largely on private investigators to go out and not always Canadians, to go out and provide them with intelligence. And things went along pretty well until, well, they still go along pretty well, but the feds never wanted federal officials, federal police officers to be doing municipal police work. But they became convinced, two municipalities, Flin Flon, Manitoba, and Melville, Saskatchewan, which had little local police forces, and there were nothing but problems, discipline, corruption, everything else. And the provincial government of Manitoba were able to convince the feds that it was in the national interest to keep the mines operating at Flin Flon. It was an important revenue resource through mining and one thing or another, and it was such an importance that they couldn't allow an undisciplined police force dealing with all the labor issues. And they convinced them to allow the first municipal contract in Flin Flon with the federal peace officers. Things started to change. The first big change, 1949, when Newfoundland joined the Confederation. Part of the bargaining chip was that we'll put our police force in there, but Newfoundland kept their own police, and they still have it today. The Newfoundland Constabulary that does actually police a part of the province, and so on. But we're the principal provincial force there, if I can put it that way. And then in 1951, things really changed. That's when British Columbia came in. And British Columbia, they had a good provincial police force. And it was older. It had been formed even before the old Northwest Mounted Police. It was an older organization and had a lot of good personnel in it. But they were threatening to unionize. And the provincial government wanted no part of that. And without even discussing it with the heads of the force, they were negotiating with the federal government for us to take over the provincial policing. And suddenly the announcement was made, and what happened? And throw off your provincial police uniform, put on a mounted police uniform, and you're the new force. Most of those members were taken over. That was part of the deal. A few were not, that were obviously not fit for that role. But most of them were, and there were a lot of good policemen came over. But it also, the contract said we would take on all the responsibilities of the former BC Provincial Police Force. Well, at one time, Burnaby, Surrey, all of those municipalities in the lower Fraser Valley had their own police force. They all went broke in the 30s. The provincial government had to have some policing, so they put in provincial policemen in all those municipalities. And when we took over the responsibilities of the provincial police, and we ended up with those huge municipalities. I don't know how many men we have now in Surrey, but there must be 200 or 300, I guess. Really, eh? 600? Over 600. Wow. When I first went to Burnaby in 1966, it was then the largest detachment. Surrey was second. Surrey was still a very rural municipality. We had just over 100 men in Burnaby, and there was a lot of fretting about that in Ottawa, and look where we are today. Now, the force as an organization has basically provided pretty darn good policing to all of those areas. But the question really is, why are federal officers doing the municipal police work in cities and towns all over the country? And it really, it's someday that it's going to have to be sorted out. The Lower Mainland, I'm going to go back to my story about my early days in British Columbia and writing a report. Well, when I got to Ottawa and suddenly had some strength, I insisted that this Lower Mainland district, which I had been commanding officer of, was not the answer. We had to move the headquarters from Victoria, put it in Vancouver, where the principal city and the principal action that influenced things all over the province took place. And there was some pretty strong political objection to that from the federal minister from Victoria, but I prevailed. I said, no, it has to be one division, and the provincial government, although the parliament, the legislature is in Victoria, they all have offices in Vancouver. The Attorney General spends as much or more time in Vancouver than he does in Victoria, and they've all got big provincial offices there. And I was able to finally put that division back together. But there's still a lot of problems. How do you really coordinate the work of those big municipal detachments? The answer to the lower Fraser Valley eventually is a strong regional police force. But, and here's the big but, regional police forces anywhere in the world that I have studied only work well if they have good regional government over them for the accountability issues and one thing or another. Well, if you take a look in the Fraser Valley, and you look at regional parks, you look at regional things, they have a hell of a time getting along and always fighting among themselves and one thing or another, and there's no regional government over them. And if someday I would predict, not in my lifetime, but someday that whole lower Fraser Valley will be subject to some form of regional governance, and with that will be a regional police force. Now, some people would say, well, why not just have the RCMP as the regional police force? Let them police Vancouver and so on. I don't think constitutionally that's, well, certainly under our constitution as presently structured, I don't think that's the role of federal government would want, and I don't think the provincial government would want. And also my own experience abroad, after I left the force and worked for United Nations, I would be very, very leery of having one huge national force that did most of the policing all over the country. I've run across that in some countries where there's no sort of counterbalance. I was attached to the Commission of Inquiry into the political violence in South Africa after I had been in South Africa with the Commonwealth Observer Mission for a period of time. In South Africa, there was only one police force. Even the big cities are policed by the same force that does the rural areas and everywhere else. There are, in the native areas, native controlled areas, there are native police forces, but in what was pre-apartheid days, or in apartheid days, there was only one police force. And nearly every regional commander had come up through the security side. And if you take a look at the actions of that police force, actually, well, I have to be careful a little, but working under the apartheid government, whose policies were so clear and reflected in the policing, some of the things that went on were absolutely terrible. We can be tremendously proud in Canada of the nation we've become, but it's also a nation with a lot of problems. Fortunately, we can find our way through most of them. Our system allows that to happen. And in terms of policing, we're pretty darn good. I've worked in many countries in South America and in Asia, where I had a lot to do with the police forces and judicial systems. We're very fortunate in the systems we have here. And my final remarks will be, I feel extraordinarily privileged coming from the hard-scrabble, uneducated background to have had over 40 years with such a wonderful bunch of people carrying out such important work in Canadian society. And I have a lot of confidence in the young people coming along today. It's different. They come from a different society. We're policing a different society, and we've got to keep step. And that takes some doing.